There's a reason the first time Titanoboa hit the news, people reacted like they'd just learned dragons were real. The story sounded like a prank. Coal miners pull strange bones out of a Colombian formation known for giant crocs and turtle tanks. Scientists give them the standard, probably another crocodilian stamp. And then a quiet recheck at the Florida Museum flips the verdict. Not a croc, a snake, a supersized torque machine of a serpent. Overnight, Titanoboa went from a dusty vertebra in a box to a cultural bogeyman, the biggest snake that ever lived, the one you joke about when a garden hose twitches. But that wasn't the whole story. What if the crown never truly belonged to Titanoboa? At least, not without an asterisk. What if another giant arrived late to the party with bones just long enough to nudge past the legend? And what if the scarier part isn't size at all, but what each snake did with it? Keep that in the back of your mind, because once you meet Vasuki indicus, the conversation changes fast. The first mistake with Titanoboa wasn't the size. Everyone agrees it was massive. The first mistake was what we assumed it was built to do. You can picture the initial scene. Early 2000s, heaps of ribs and vertebrae turn up from coal mines in what's now a paleontologist's playground. The bones are big, unusually clean, and familiar enough that no one panics. In a formation stacked with reptilian heavies, a large croc-like backbone doesn't exactly set off fireworks. Tag it, bag it, move on. Only later, almost by accident, does a new set of eyes rerun the puzzle and realize the curves, facets, and articulations aren't crocodilian at all. They're serpentine, and not big python in a pet shop. Serpentine. We're talking a trunk built like a pressurized fire hose. From there, the numbers did what numbers always do in headlines. 12 to 13 meters? 14? People ran with the most extreme estimates, and the story calcified. Titanoboa, the croc breaker, the swamp reaper, the anaconda turned up to 11. It dethroned an old favorite, Gigantophus, and planted a flag so firmly that the public barely learned the previous king's name. That's how myths are made, fast, loud, and sticky. But underneath the hype, the details kept shifting, and those details matter. Because monsters don't just win by being long, they win because of what their bodies make them good at. And Titanoboa's body has always been hiding a confession. When cranial pieces finally joined the party, the skull didn't quite match the anaconda with gym membership poster. The palate was odd. The tooth count was off. Some teeth curved like fish hooks more than pig-spearing spikes, and that detail alone should raise an eyebrow. Then stack the habitat. Warm, river-laced lowlands with a buffet of big fish. The fossils don't sit alone. They hang out with lungfish and ancient bony tongues like regular dinner guests. Suddenly, the picture sharpens. All that bulk? Not necessarily for wrestling armored crocs every Tuesday. More like a living pipeline designed to steer and pin slippery muscular prey in deep channels, with a skull that favors holding and maneuvering rather than prying open huge terrestrial meals. Not a mammal slayer of the jungle, a specialist in sushi on industrial scale. That doesn't make Titanoboa soft. It makes it optimized. It likely ruled the water-edge lanes the way a bear owns a salmon run, by being in the exact right place with the exact right toolkit. Even the most terrifying animals sometimes carry a single story in their teeth. For Titanoboa, that story reads like a menu. So Titanoboa was gigantic, yes, but the everything-eating constrictor line was mostly a vibe. The bones keep whispering, fish. And just as that reinterpretation started stabilizing, another giant slid out of a 19-year pause, like it had been waiting for its cue. Vasuki indicus didn't shout when it arrived. It rumbled. The bones had been sitting in collections since the mid-2000s. Almost 3 dozen vertebrae, a few even in a lifelike arrangement from Eocene India. The first pass? Same old mistake. Must be a croc. Second glance, many years later? Not a croc, not a boa either. A matsoid. One of those ancient lineages that doesn't follow modern snake rules, like everyone else does. Now the part people care about: length. Even the conservative math pushes Vasuki toward the front of the line, 36 to 40 feet in the lower estimates. But the wider prehistoric dimensions give a more audacious reading, numbers hovering right around 50 feet. That's half a basketball court. That's city bus energy. And here's the twist that rattles the crown. Even if Titanoboa and Vasuki overlap in mass, with Titanoboa potentially stockier, Vasuki's bones speak to a different lifestyle entirely. It didn't read like a dedicated fisher. It didn't look built for trees. And while it could swim, this wasn't a serpent content to drift shoulder deep in a river waiting for dinner to swim into its mouth. The vertebrae, ribs, and overall proportions point to a terrestrial ambusher, low, patient, and mean, with a trunk wired for constriction and a life spent crawling across land mosaics where nearly everything walked on legs. If your mental image of giant snake has you scanning the waterline, Vasuki forces you to glance at the ground first, and then to the tall grass right next to your ankle. Titanoboa's story is where it fed. Vasuki's story is what it could dare. Here's where the matsoid label gets uncomfortable. Modern boas and pythons flex a neat party trick: elastic ligaments and extraskeletal allowances that open a mouth like a drawbridge. That's what lets one animal swallow another that looks unswallowable. Matsoids? They weren't gifted the same cheat codes. They had teeth you'd rather not think about, with cutting, gripping, and raking in their job descriptions. Where a boa stages one long, horrifying inhale, a matsoid could have fed more like a komodo on a carcass, or a moray working meat fibers off bone, taking chunks, not single-piece victories. If that makes you think brutal, you're hearing it right. Now combine it with power. Anacondas squeeze at pressures that are already cartoonish. Scale the architecture up to Vasuki, and the attachment surfaces for muscle explode in size. The ribs sit high, the trunk rounds into a true cylinder, and the vertebrae flare broad where force needs to travel. If Titanoboa's forte was steering aquatic prey into submission, Vasuki reads like it could turn the land around it into a booby trap. Quiet, invisible, then instant. The kind of predator that doesn't chase you, because it never needs to. Don't let that slow and heavy image lull you either. Most ambush predators trade sprint speed for first strike authority. If you felt the first coil, you lost the match 2 seconds earlier. All of this lives inside a place and time that supercharged the experiment. Mid-Eocene India wasn't today's peninsula. It sat warmer, wetter, and more isolated, with habitats broken into marshes, back swamps, and riverine mosaics that stacked prey like shelves in a pantry. Crocodilians lounged at the margins. Giant catfish cut dark lanes through murk. Early whales drifted between identities. More hoofed beach mammal that's learning to swim than streamlined ocean torpedo. Sirenians tried on limbs, like they were still making up their minds about sea versus shore. Pythons threaded the same spaces and likely left descendants you'd still recognize. This is where Vasuki makes the ecosystem feel tense. A giant snake in the water already existed. You didn't need Vasuki to be that. What the landscape didn't have until it did was a land-first constrictor that could threaten almost anything sharing ground. Not because it outran its neighbors, because it outweighed them. Now imagine being another animal in that world. The water has its own serpents. The land has a bigger one. The escape route becomes philosophical. So who wins the biggest brawl? Depends which ruler you pick. Length? Vasuki has a strong case. Mass? Titanoboa might keep a narrow edge, but the better question is, who's more terrifying to bump into? If you're a fish the size of a coffee table, Titanoboa is a nightmare with perfect aim. If you're anything with lungs and limbs on the Eocene floodplain, Vasuki is the one that rewrites your morning route. Both giants look invincible until you zoom out. The same climate engine that minted them started dialing the knobs the other way. Peak Eocene heat spikes gave way to a long fade into cooler, drier patterns. Swamps retreated, rivers narrowed, food webs thinned. Big bodies need big budgets. When the pantry closes early, giants starve first. By the time the Eocene bowed out, the tracks of both legends were already fading. The world didn't need a bigger predator. It needed one that could run on less. Not extinction in a single blow, more like a ceiling lowering over centuries until there wasn't room to stand up straight. That's how most empires die. Not with a clash, but with a climate. Here's the line that trips people up. Titanoboa is famous because it was discovered first and framed with a hyper-predator narrative that's easy to sell. Vasuki arrived later in quieter tones and told a story that's harder to print on a t-shirt. But bones don't owe us good slogans. They owe us the truth of an animal's design. And that truth says two things at once. Titanoboa may have worn the wrong costume in our imaginations. The teeth, skull, and fossil neighbors point to a fish-first lifestyle. It could still crush, still coil, still bully, but its sweet spot was wet, deep, and full of fins. Vasuki indicus was the terrestrial problem. Long enough to contest the tape, engineered for land ambush, and strong enough to make the ground itself feel like a trap door. Whether it outweighed Titanoboa is less important than what it meant to stand within its reach. So who's the real king? The honest answer is boring and perfect. Kings ruled different kingdoms. One ruled the river corridors like a living dam. The other ruled the rushes and margins where feet sank into wet soil and every stand of reeds could turn alive. If you forced a single crown on one skull, the drama fan in you picks Vasuki. Not because the scale on a measuring tape says so beyond all doubt, but because the rules it played by feel more personal. Titanoboa scares the part of you that hates deep water. Vasuki scares the part of you that walks through tall grass and suddenly stops breathing. And that's the quiet payoff to the whole debate. The biggest snake ever isn't just a number you dig out of a vertebra. It's a mood. It's a shape placed in a habitat that lets it do exactly the thing you hope it never does. Which makes the closing thought simple. Names and superlatives fade. What lasts is a picture. Heat pressing down on a marsh, insects furring the air, the splash of some early whale too confident a few yards from shore, followed by nothing. Not a chase, not a struggle you hear from far away. Just the sudden rearrangement of the reeds, a curve where there wasn't one a moment ago, and silence folding back over the water like a blanket. If you want to know who really ruled, ask which scene you'd rather walk into. Exactly. Me neither. But that wasn't the whole story. Because if you zoom the lens just a little wider, you find out these monsters didn't rise from nowhere. They pulled themselves up on a ladder of climate, prey, and accident. Conditions we can map, test, and argue about. Which means the next time you see someone claim a brand new, largest ever, you'll know the right questions to ask. Not how long, not even how heavy. Ask, built for what and where? That's the part the bones never exaggerate.